Entitled Kid Offends Royal Guard, Watch What Happens Next. Emotional Stories. Royal Guards. The morning sun had just begun to shine over the royal palace, casting golden light on the tall, ornate gates and the sprawling gardens that stretched beyond them. Tourists and visitors were slowly trickling in, their cameras swinging from their necks, ready to capture the grand architecture and the disciplined beauty of the palace guards. Among the visitors was a young child, no more than 7 years old, holding tightly onto the hand of their mother. The child's wide eyes sparkled with curiosity, reflecting the grandeur that surrounded them. Everything about the palace seemed magical, the shining flags fluttering in the breeze, the neatly trimmed hedges, and the cobblestone paths that led from one grand courtyard to another. The child's family had been planning this visit for weeks. They had read about the palace guards, famous for their stoic expressions and unshakable discipline, and the child had been especially fascinated. "Mom, I want to see the guards up close," the child had pleaded the night before, bouncing with excitement on their bed. Their parents had promised they would, but they also reminded the child to be polite and to follow all the rules. Now, as they approached the main courtyard, the child could hardly contain their excitement. The palace guards stood in perfect formation, their dark uniforms pristine and their tall hats almost comically stiff, yet commanding respect. Their faces were expressionless, as if carved from stone, and their posture was so straight it seemed impossible for anyone to move in such a way for hours at a time. Visitors whispered to each other, cameras snapping discreetly, careful not to disturb the solemnity of the guards' duties. The child, however, had a different perspective. While the adults saw discipline and formality, the child saw something alive and almost mysterious. One guard, in particular, caught the child's attention. He stood at the far side of the courtyard, his posture rigid, hands resting calmly on the ceremonial sword at his side. There was something about the way he stood so still that made the child feel like he was a statue that might spring to life at any moment. "Look, Mom, that guard is like a superhero," the child whispered, tugging at their mother's sleeve. She smiled, kneeling down to their level. "Yes, he is very strong and disciplined," she said gently. "But remember, we have to be respectful. We can watch, but we shouldn't touch or distract him." The child nodded solemnly, or at least tried to. Curiosity, as it often does, had a way of taking over, especially in children. As the family moved closer, the child noticed small things that made the scene even more fascinating. The guard's boots were perfectly polished, his gloves spotless, and even the tiniest movement seemed precise and intentional. It was as if every action had been practiced 1,000 times, yet it all appeared effortless. While the adults admired the guards from a distance, the child edged a little closer, eager to see every detail. They crouched slightly, peeking around a post, their eyes wide with fascination. They noticed a slight twitch in the guard's hand as he adjusted his hat, a tiny movement that revealed he was, after all, human. The child giggled softly, thinking it was funny that someone so serious could still have little habits like everyone else. Encouraged by this discovery, the child took a tiny step forward, forgetting momentarily the instructions to stay back. They pointed at the guard and whispered to their sibling who was standing nearby, "Look, he's trying to balance that big hat. I think he's a little like us." Their sibling snickered, and the mother, noticing the movement, gently put a hand on the child's shoulder. "Sweetheart, stay right here. Remember what I told you," she said softly. But the child's attention was already wandering. Their imagination had transformed the courtyard into a stage, the guards into statues come to life, and the ceremonial swords into shining swords of knights from storybooks. It was at this moment that the child, in a burst of playful curiosity, made a small, innocent gesture, pointing, laughing lightly, and even sticking out a tongue briefly in jest. The child didn't think anything of it. To them, it was just a fun way to express their wonder. But to the guard, who had been observing the crowd with trained eyes, It was something else. He noticed the child's gesture immediately. Though he was trained to remain calm and maintain the solemnity of his position, his instincts told him that someone was stepping out of line, even if it was just a small child. His expression tightened slightly, a subtle shift that only someone paying very close attention might notice. The crowd around them began to sense the tension. Other visitors whispered to each other, their cameras lowering slightly. Some adults nudged their children closer, offering quiet warnings not to disturb the guards. The palace, always a place of elegance and composure, now held a momentary stillness that felt heavier than the morning sun. The child, oblivious to the subtle change, continued to giggle and chatter, turning toward their mother to describe how the guards' boots gleamed like mirrors. "Mom, look, they shine so much. Can you see yourself in them?" The mother, now more concerned, leaned closer and whispered, "Sweetheart, that's enough. Let's not distract the guard, okay?" But it was too late. The guard's eyes had met the child's for just a brief moment. It was a glance filled not with anger, but with a firm awareness of duty. The child froze for a second, sensing that something had shifted, though they didn't fully understand what. Their playful energy dimmed slightly, replaced by a mix of curiosity and a tiny flicker of fear. The atmosphere in the courtyard was charged with unspoken communication. The crowd watched quietly, intrigued by the silent exchange between a child and a guard who seemed larger than life. Even the parents felt a strange mixture of pride and worry. Pride that their child was confident enough to explore and interact with the world, and worry that something innocent could be misinterpreted in such a formal setting. For the child, however, the moment was not about fear. It was about fascination. They noticed details they had never seen before. The way the guard's hat caught the light, the precise way his hands rested on the sword, and the calm, controlled breathing that kept his posture perfect. There was something mesmerizing about the guard, something that made the child want to understand the rules that made someone so disciplined. And then, as if sensing the child's genuine curiosity, the guard made the smallest of movements, a tilt of the head, a micro-smile hidden beneath his stoic expression, almost imperceptible to the casual observer. It was a gesture that softened the rigidity of the moment, hinting at the humanity beneath the uniform. The child noticed it immediately, their eyes lighting up again, this time with wonder rather than mischief. The mother, seeing this interaction, felt a wave of relief. She whispered, "See, even he's human. But now let's step back and watch quietly." The child nodded eagerly, stepping a small distance away but keeping their gaze fixed on the guard. They were learning, in their own way, about boundaries, respect, and the delicate balance between rules and human connection. As the family slowly moved along the courtyard, the child couldn't help but glance back repeatedly. That single, brief encounter had already left a lasting impression. They didn't yet understand the full significance of what had just happened, but deep down, they felt that something important had been shared. A silent understanding between a curious mind and a disciplined guardian. Other visitors returned to their own explorations, but for the child, the palace had become more than just a place of grandeur and history. It had become a living classroom, where curiosity, respect, and human connection came together in a moment that seemed to suspend time. And though the day had just begun, this small incident would become the story that the child remembered most vividly from their visit to the royal palace. Little did they know, this playful moment of mischief would set the stage for the rest of the day, a day that would teach lessons about patience, understanding, and the surprising ways in which kindness could emerge from the most formal of situations. The atmosphere in the royal courtyard had changed subtly after the brief encounter between the child and the guard. Where moments ago there had been only curiosity and playful excitement, now a quiet tension lingered in the air. The crowd, which had been chatting and taking pictures, seemed to sense that something unusual was happening. Parents clutched their children's hands a little tighter, and even the guards, who were trained to ignore distractions, appeared slightly more alert. The child, still bubbling with energy, had frozen for a second after the guard's steady gaze met theirs. That gaze had been firm but not harsh, commanding respect without anger. The child's heart had raced with a strange mixture of fear and fascination. For the first time, they realized that their actions, even playful ones, could carry meaning beyond what they intended. Yet curiosity, as it always does, began to push against the invisible boundary. "Mom, can I ask him a question?" the child whispered, eyes wide with innocence. The mother, kneeling beside the child, took a deep breath. She wanted to protect her child, but she also knew that curiosity was a natural part of learning. "Not yet, sweetheart," she said softly. "Let's watch quietly first. You can learn a lot just by observing." The child nodded, though their mind was already racing with ideas. They wanted to know everything about the guard. Why did he stand so still? How could he stay so serious for so long? What made him so disciplined? The courtyard had suddenly become more than a place of beauty. It was a living puzzle, full of questions waiting to be answered. The guard, meanwhile, had noticed the child's curiosity. He had been trained for years to respond to situations with calm and composure, but something about the child's genuine wonder caught his attention. It was not mischief or disrespect, but pure fascination. In a place where people often rushed past, taking pictures without a thought, this small child had stopped to really observe. The guard shifted slightly, adjusting his stance while maintaining the same formal posture. Around them, the crowd had begun to murmur quietly. Some parents pointed discreetly to their own children, using the moment as a subtle reminder to be polite. "See, you have to be respectful around the guards," one whispered. Cameras clicked softly, capturing the precise balance between discipline and humanity that filled the courtyard. The child's sibling, standing a few steps away, leaned closer and whispered, "Do you think he noticed you?" The child's eyes widened. "I think he did," they replied, their voice almost reverent. "But he's not angry. I think he's trying to understand me too." Their mother smiled faintly at the observation. She could see the child learning an important lesson. Respect was not about fear, but about understanding. Yet she also worried that the child's excitement might unintentionally lead to trouble. She gently placed her hand on the child's shoulder. "Let's move a little, okay? We can still watch, but let's not get too close." As the family shifted their position, the child's gaze remained fixed on the guard. Each movement of the guard seemed deliberate and precise. Every small adjustment of his gloves, every careful step, was executed with meticulous care. The child whispered softly, almost to themselves, "It's like watching a dance, a really serious dance." The guard, fully aware of the child's presence, maintained his composure. But he also allowed a tiny signal of recognition, a slight tilt of the head, a subtle nod that went unnoticed by most of the crowd. The child caught it immediately, feeling a mixture of surprise and joy. That small gesture communicated more than words ever could. It said, "I see your curiosity and I respect it." Meanwhile, the palace staff moved quietly through the courtyard, attending to their duties without disturbing the scene. Visitors began to notice the unusual interaction, and whispers spread like a gentle breeze. People began to watch more closely, not because of the child's actions, but because they sensed that something meaningful was unfolding in the midst of the ceremonial routine. The child, emboldened by the guard's subtle recognition, took a cautious step closer. Their mother's hand instinctively reached out, but the child looked up at her with pleading eyes. "Just one step, Mom. I just want to see his boots. They're so shiny." Her heart ached between wanting to protect her child and allowing them to explore the world. She exhaled slowly and gave a gentle nod. "All right, but just one step. Then we step back, okay?" The child's eyes sparkled as they took that small step, crouching slightly to examine the guard's boots. Indeed, they were polished to perfection, reflecting the sunlight like mirrors. The child's reflection, tiny and curious, shimmered in the leather. They could see the attention to detail that went into every aspect of the guard's appearance. To the child, it was not just about shining boots. It was a lesson in dedication, discipline, and pride in one's duties. The guard noticed the child's careful observation and allowed another small gesture of acknowledgement. A soft, almost imperceptible exhale of breath, a slight shift in weight conveyed patience and tolerance. It was as if the guard understood that the child's intentions were pure, not disrespectful. For a moment, the formality of the courtyard softened, creating a bridge between strict rules and human understanding. Other visitors had begun to gather, sensing the unusual connection. Some whispered to their friends, sharing the story of a small child and a royal guard who, through silent communication, had created a moment of mutual respect. Cameras clicked discreetly, capturing the interaction as something more than a simple tourist snapshot. It was a story, frozen in time, of curiosity meeting discipline. The child's sibling, noticing the attention, leaned closer. "Do you think he's smiling?" The child shook their head slowly. "Not really, but I think he's kind. That's better than a smile. It feels like he understands me." Their mother, observing the exchange, felt a mix of pride and relief. She realized that this small moment was teaching her child lessons that no textbook could offer. Curiosity, patience, respect, and observation, all wrapped into a single, silent interaction. Just as the family began to step back to give the guard more space, another tourist, unaware of the delicate balance, accidentally shouted a question. The sound echoed across the courtyard, breaking the fragile calm. The guard's posture remained perfect, his expression unchanged, but his eyes flicked briefly toward the noise. The child, startled by the sudden break in focus, instinctively clutched their mother's hand. "See, that's why we have to be careful," their mother whispered. "Even small actions can change everything around us." The child nodded, understanding not in words but in feeling. They had learned that discipline and patience were not just about standing still or following rules. They were about controlling oneself, observing the world and responding thoughtfully, even in unexpected situations. For a few more minutes, the family watched quietly from a distance. The child's fascination continued to grow. They noticed how the guard's hat remained perfectly balanced, how every tiny motion seemed measured and meaningful. It was a performance, yes, but a performance with purpose, a purpose that went beyond showing strength or authority. It was a demonstration of dedication, respect, and care for something larger than oneself. Eventually, the family decided it was time to move on, to continue exploring the palace grounds. The child, though reluctant, followed their mother's hand, glancing back one last time at the guard. That final glance captured everything they had experienced. The awe, the learning, the small but powerful connection that had formed without a single word being spoken. As they walked away, the child whispered softly, almost to themselves, "I want to be like that someday, calm, strong, and kind." Their mother smiled, squeezing their hand. "And you will, sweetheart. You'll learn many things in life, but moments like this will help guide you." The guard, meanwhile, continued his post, standing tall and silent, but perhaps a little lighter in spirit. Even in the midst of strict rules and unyielding duty, a small child's curiosity had reminded him of the humanity in his role, the simple joy of connecting with another person, even in silence. And though the courtyard slowly returned to its usual rhythm, the memory of that morning lingered. For the child, it was a moment of wonder and learning. For the guard, it was a reminder that even in a world of precision and formality, kindness and understanding could shine quietly, like the reflection of sunlight on polished boots. Little did anyone know, the incident that had begun as a playful gesture would shape the events of the day in ways neither the child nor the guard could yet imagine. The lessons of observation, respect, and human connection were only beginning, and the story of the small child who dared to be curious was far from over. The morning continued, and the sun climbed higher, casting a warm glow over the royal palace. The child's family had moved to another section of the courtyard, walking slowly along the stone paths lined with colorful flowers and neatly trimmed hedges. Despite moving on, the child's attention kept drifting back toward the guard. Their eyes, bright with curiosity, searched for any sign, any gesture that could reveal more about the mysterious figure who had captured their fascination. The guard remained in his position, tall and unyielding, as if he were part of the palace itself. Visitors walked past him without noticing the delicate interaction that had already occurred. But for the child, the guard was no longer just a uniformed figure. He had become a symbol of discipline, patience, and quiet strength. Every small movement he made was magnified in the child's mind, the way he adjusted his gloves, the subtle shift of his stance, the calmness in his eyes. "Mom," the child whispered again, tugging lightly at her sleeve. "Do you think he notices me even now?" The mother glanced at the guard from a distance. She smiled faintly, sensing the same small nod or tilt she had seen before. "I think he does," she replied softly. "He probably notices when someone watches with respect, not mischief." Encouraged, the child edged slightly closer, walking slowly along the path. They stopped behind a small fountain, crouching slightly to hide from the crowd while keeping the guard in sight. Their imagination was running wild, turning the courtyard into a stage where the child and the guard were the main characters. To the child, this was more than a palace. It was a place where lessons could be learned without anyone speaking a word. The guard, noticing the child's careful observation, allowed himself a very small gesture. He shifted his weight slightly, enough that it looked natural, but also enough that the child could see it. It was not a full smile or an acknowledgement that broke protocol, but it was something, a tiny spark of humanity that bridged the gap between the formality of the role and the innocence of the child. The child's eyes widened. He's looking at me," they whispered to their sibling who was nearby. The sibling leaned closer, fascinated as well. "I think he likes you," they said softly, though neither fully understood the meaning of that word in this context. The mother, observing, felt a mixture of relief and cautious concern. She whispered to the child, "Remember, sweetie, respect is important. You can admire him, but let's not disturb him." The child nodded, taking care to make no sudden movements, yet their excitement could hardly be contained. A few more visitors passed through the courtyard, some stopping to take photographs of the guards. The child noticed that many adults seemed hurried, moving past the guards quickly without paying attention. They felt lucky to be able to observe someone so extraordinary, someone who combined strict discipline with hints of patience and kindness. In the child's mind, the guard became larger than life, like a hero from a storybook who could teach lessons without ever saying a word. Then, something unexpected happened. The guard, sensing that the child's curiosity was genuine, made another subtle move. He leaned slightly to the side, a barely perceptible motion, and his eyes softened just a fraction. The child noticed immediately. Their heart leapt, not from fear but from a sense of connection. It was as if the guard was silently saying, "I understand your curiosity. I see that you mean no harm." The child whispered to themselves, "He's not just standing there, he's watching me too." They felt a surge of excitement and admiration. For a child, such a silent exchange carried immense weight. It was proof that even someone as serious as a royal guard could acknowledge another person without breaking rules, without words, and yet still communicate clearly. Encouraged, the child took another careful step closer. This time they crouched behind a small column near the fountain, peeking around it to get a better view. They studied every detail, the polished boots reflecting sunlight, the careful stitching on the uniform, the ceremonial sword held with perfect alignment. It was all so precise, so beautiful, and the child's imagination transformed the scene into a story where they were learning secrets of discipline and bravery firsthand. The guard, ever observant, did not turn away or react sharply. Instead, he maintained his composure while allowing tiny signals of acknowledgement. He shifted his stance just enough to show awareness without breaking the formality of his role. To anyone else, it would have looked like nothing had changed. To the child, however, it was everything. They felt seen, respected, and even encouraged to continue observing and learning. Nearby visitors began to notice the unusual intensity in the child's focus. A few parents nudged their own children, whispering lessons about patience and respect. Others glanced curiously at the guard, wondering what had captured the child's attention so completely. Cameras clicked quietly, but no one dared interrupt. There was something special happening, something unspoken that could not be captured fully on film. The child's sibling whispered, "Do you think he's going to talk to you?" The child shook their head. "No, but he doesn't have to. I feel like he's teaching me already." The sibling smiled faintly, impressed by the child's insight. For the mother, the moment was profound. She realized that her child was learning in a way that books or lessons could never teach. The value of observation, respect, patience, and quiet courage. Even without words, the child was absorbing lessons that would stay with them for a lifetime. She squeezed the child's hand gently, whispering, "You're learning something very special here." As the minutes passed, the child continued to observe. They noticed subtle shifts in the guard's expression, tiny movements that revealed a human side beneath the strict exterior. Perhaps the guard was adjusting to the warmth of the sun, or maybe he was momentarily distracted by the child's careful observation. Whatever the reason, it was enough to fascinate the child completely. Suddenly, a gentle breeze blew through the courtyard, rustling the flags and flowers. The child's hair lifted slightly, and they laughed softly at the sensation. The guard, ever disciplined, did not flinch, but the child imagined that even he could feel the warmth of the morning sun and the soft touch of the breeze. The child whispered, "Even he must feel it, even he enjoys this moment." Encouraged by their imagination, the child took another small step, edging closer along the path. Their mother followed closely, keeping a careful hand on their shoulder. "All right, just a little closer, but remember to be quiet," she said softly. The child nodded eagerly, tiptoeing slightly, careful not to startle anyone. The guard shifted his weight subtly again, a barely noticeable signal that he was aware of the child's movements. It was a silent acknowledgement, a small bridge between two very different worlds, one of strict discipline and ceremonial duty, and one of boundless curiosity and innocence. The child felt a surge of joy, as if they had discovered a secret code between themselves and the guard. Nearby tourists whispered quietly to each other, sensing that something meaningful was unfolding. They noticed the child's wide-eyed focus, the careful posture, and the way the guard seemed to respond without words. Cameras clicked softly, but no one spoke aloud. It was as if the entire courtyard had paused to witness this quiet exchange. The child's mother whispered, "See, patience and observation are powerful. You're learning more than you realize." The child nodded, absorbing every word, though most of the lesson was being learned silently through the interaction itself. Then, the guard did something remarkable. He allowed the smallest gesture of acknowledgement, a brief, almost imperceptible nod toward the child. It was not a full smile, nor a word, but it was enough. The child's eyes widened and they whispered excitedly, He's talking to me without words." The sibling giggled softly. "That's amazing, only you could notice that." The mother smiled faintly, proud of the child's focus and insight. She realized that this moment was teaching something far beyond the rules of the palace. Empathy, observation, patience, and respect for others, even in situations where communication was limited. For the guard, The experience was equally subtle but profound. Though his duty demanded strictness and composure, he had allowed himself a brief, silent connection. He had acknowledged the child's curiosity, recognized their innocence, and maintained his discipline without compromise. In that moment, he felt the quiet satisfaction of teaching an unspoken lesson through presence alone. The child, filled with excitement and admiration, whispered again, "I want to learn everything about him, about how he stands so tall and calm." Their mother gently squeezed their hand. "You'll learn, sweetie. Today is just the beginning." And so the morning continued, the child observing, the guard standing tall, and the courtyard filled with quiet tension and unspoken understanding. For the first time, the child began to understand that respect was not just about following rules. It was about noticing, appreciating, and connecting in small, meaningful ways. Little did the child know, this silent turning point would shape the rest of their day at the palace, leading to experiences that were as emotional as they were educational. The lessons learned in that quiet exchange would stay with them far longer than the grandeur of the palace itself. The afternoon sun was now high above the royal palace, casting long shadows across the cobblestone courtyard. Visitors had begun to spread out, exploring the palace grounds, taking photographs, and enjoying the carefully maintained gardens. Yet for the small child, the palace seemed to have narrowed into one special focus: the royal guard who had captured their attention earlier in the morning. Every detail of the guard's posture, uniform, and disciplined presence stayed firmly in the child's mind. The child's family had moved to a nearby bench to rest for a moment, the mother sitting and catching her breath while the child leaned slightly forward, peering around at the guard's figure. Despite the strict and serious appearance of the guard, the child felt a strange sense of warmth emanating from him. The earlier subtle gestures, the slight tilt of the head, the tiny nod, the softened eyes, had planted a seed in the child's imagination. They were starting to see that behind the rigid uniform and tall hat was a human being, capable of understanding and even quiet kindness. The guard continued his post, standing perfectly still as if the weight of the palace itself rested on his shoulders. Passers-by moved around him, snapping photos or murmuring quietly to each other. Most people treated him as a statue, a symbol of tradition and discipline, but the child no longer saw him as simply a guard. They saw him as a teacher, a figure who, without words, could convey lessons about patience, respect, and calmness. The child whispered to their sibling, who was sitting beside them on the bench. "I think he's smiling at me again," they said softly, eyes wide with excitement. Their sibling leaned over to look, though they could not see a clear smile. "I don't see it," the sibling whispered back. "Maybe it's in your imagination." The child shook their head. "No, it's real. I can feel it. He's being kind in his own way." The mother overheard the conversation and smiled. She could see that her child was learning something very valuable, something far beyond the walls of the palace. It was a lesson in observation, empathy, and understanding that could not be taught in a classroom. She gently placed her hand on the child's shoulder. "Yes, sweetie, sometimes people show kindness without even saying a word. That's a very special thing to notice." Feeling encouraged, the child slowly stood up and took a few careful steps closer to the guard's post. Their small heart pounded with excitement and a little bit of nervousness. They wanted to be closer, to observe the guard more carefully, but they also remembered their mother's advice: always be respectful. The guard, ever observant, noticed the child's movement. He did not break protocol or shift sharply, but he allowed the smallest change in his stance, a subtle lean forward that maintained formality while acknowledging the child's presence. It was a gesture so slight that most people would not have noticed it, but to the child it was everything. It was a silent communication, a gentle invitation that said, "I see you, and it is safe to observe." The child's eyes lit up. They whispered softly, "He's talking to me without words again." Their sibling smiled quietly, impressed by the child's focus and patience. The mother, standing close by, felt her heart swell with pride. She realized that this moment was teaching her child something more valuable than any palace tour could offer: the power of quiet understanding. Nearby visitors had begun to notice the child's careful observation as well. Some whispered among themselves, sharing smiles and glances, sensing that something extraordinary was unfolding. The guard's perfect composure contrasted with the child's innocent curiosity, creating a moment that felt almost magical. Cameras clicked softly, but no one interrupted. Everyone seemed to understand that this was not a moment to capture, but a moment to witness quietly. The child, emboldened by the guard's subtle acknowledgement, took another cautious step forward. They crouched slightly behind a small column, peeking around it to get a better view. Every detail of the guard's posture fascinated them. The alignment of the uniform, the polished boots reflecting sunlight, the ceremonial sword held with perfect precision. The child's mind transformed the scene into a story, imagining themselves learning secrets of patience and discipline directly from the guard. Then, a gentle breeze swept across the courtyard, lifting the flags and rustling the leaves of nearby trees. The child giggled softly as the wind brushed against their hair, imagining that even the guard could feel the warmth of the sun and the gentle touch of the breeze. For a moment, they pictured the guard as more than a figure of authority. He was a human being, experiencing the same world in his own way. The guard, though never moving in a way that broke his strict form, allowed another tiny gesture of acknowledgement. He shifted his weight slightly, enough that the child could see he was aware of their presence and curiosity. It was a small, almost imperceptible act, but for the child, it was powerful. It communicated patience, understanding, and even a kind of respect for the innocence and wonder they carried. Encouraged by this silent communication, the child took a small, bold step forward. They crouched behind the edge of the fountain, leaning slightly to observe the guard more closely. Their eyes were wide with excitement and admiration. They noticed every tiny detail: the careful stitching of the uniform, the polished gloves, and the calm focus in the guard's eyes. Each observation was a lesson in its own right, teaching the child about dedication, responsibility, and respect for others. The sibling sitting nearby whispered, "I think he's showing you how to be brave, even while standing still." The child nodded, understanding in a way that went beyond words. They were learning lessons about patience and courage, about the quiet strength it takes to remain composed, and about the value of observing and respecting others. The mother watched the interaction, feeling a deep sense of gratitude. She realized that her child was experiencing a rare kind of learning, one that combined observation, imagination, and emotional understanding. It was a moment that would stay with them for years, shaping how they viewed discipline, kindness, and human connection. After a few minutes, the guard made a slightly larger gesture, a small, almost hidden nod toward the child. It was not a smile or a spoken word, but it carried warmth and acknowledgement. The child's eyes widened and they whispered, He's really talking to me without words." The mother smiled, understanding that her child was absorbing lessons that could not be written down or taught in a typical way. It was the kind of learning that came from careful observation, patience, and openness to small gestures of kindness. Nearby tourists whispered quietly to each other, noticing the unusual focus and intensity of the child's attention. They admired the guard's discipline and the child's curiosity, understanding that something meaningful was unfolding. The atmosphere in the courtyard had shifted. It was no longer just a place of formality, but a place where silent lessons and connections could take root. The child took a final step closer, crouching near the fountain, eyes fixed on the guard. Their heart was full of excitement and respect. They had learned something powerful: that discipline could be kind, that strength could be gentle, and that silent gestures could communicate more than words ever could. The guard, maintaining his post, allowed one last subtle gesture, a soft shift of his stance, a small nod, a recognition of the child's curiosity and respect. It was a moment of connection, bridging the gap between strict duty and human understanding. Feeling encouraged, the child turned to their mother and whispered, "I want to remember this forever. I want to be patient and kind like him." The mother smiled, her heart full. "You will, sweetheart. You're learning something very important today." As the family began to move on, leaving the guard to his post, the child glanced back one last time. The subtle gestures, the quiet acknowledgement, and the feeling of connection stayed with them. The palace, with all its grandeur, had become a place of learning and wonder, not just for sightseeing, but for understanding life's quiet lessons. Even the guard, standing tall and composed, seemed to carry a small warmth in his heart. In that brief exchange, he had reminded himself of the humanity within his role, and the joy that could come from acknowledging another person's curiosity with patience and respect. The day continued, but the memory of that silent connection between the child and the guard remained vivid. It was a lesson in empathy, observation, and understanding, lessons that would guide the child long after they left the palace grounds. And in that quiet, formal courtyard, a bond had been formed, invisible yet profound, between a curious child and a disciplined guardian. Little did the child know, this moment of silent understanding would become one of the most cherished memories of their life, a story they would remember and share for years, about a day when curiosity met patience, and kindness emerged in the most unexpected of ways. The afternoon sun had begun to soften, turning the bright golden light into a gentle, warm glow across the royal palace grounds. Visitors slowly made their way toward the palace gates, some stopping one last time to take photographs, while others lingered to admire the gardens, fountains, and ornate architecture. For the small child and their family, however, the palace had transformed from a grand tourist attraction into a place of quiet learning, where lessons about patience, respect, and human kindness had quietly unfolded. The child walked slowly beside their mother, their small hand firmly grasping hers. Their eyes kept wandering back toward the guard's post, as if expecting to see the tall, disciplined figure standing perfectly still, silently communicating wisdom. Even though they had already observed him for hours, the child felt as if there were still countless details they had not yet discovered. The polished boots, the ceremonial sword, the precise movements, all of it fascinated them. Yet more than that, it was the way the guard had acknowledged their presence without speaking that stayed in their mind. "Mom," the child whispered softly, their voice filled with awe, "do you think he even knows how much he taught me today?" The mother smiled gently, glancing down at her child. "I think he might, sweetheart. Sometimes people don't say much, but their actions speak louder than words. You've learned a lot just by watching." She squeezed the child's hand reassuringly. "You saw patience, you saw respect, and you saw kindness in silence. Those are lessons you can carry with you forever." The child nodded slowly, taking in her words. They could still feel the excitement from the morning, mixed with a quiet sense of understanding. Their mind replayed every small gesture, the subtle nod, the tiny shift in posture, the moment when the guard seemed to acknowledge their curiosity. Each moment had been a small story in itself, teaching them more than they could have imagined. As they walked along the stone pathway toward the palace exit, the child's sibling leaned closer and whispered, "I still can't believe he didn't say a single word, and yet it felt like he talked to you." The child smiled softly. "I know, that's what's amazing. He didn't need to say anything. I could feel what he meant. That's why it's so special." The mother watched the two children with pride. She realized that today had been far more than a simple visit to a historical site. It had been a journey into the understanding of human behavior, a lesson in connecting with others without the need for words, and a moment that would leave a lasting imprint on her children's hearts. As they approached the palace gates, the child glanced back one last time at the courtyard. The guards still stood in their precise formation, tall and serious as ever. To most visitors, they were simply figures of tradition and duty, almost like statues come to life. But to the child, they were more than that. They were teachers, examples of discipline and calmness, and reminders that strength and kindness could exist together. The mother bent down to whisper to her child, "You know, sweetie, this is a memory you'll never forget. Moments like these don't happen every day. You'll carry what you learned here for the rest of your life." The child nodded, a quiet smile spreading across their face. They felt proud, not because they had done anything extraordinary, but because they had observed, learned, and understood something important. They had witnessed how respect, patience, and human kindness could coexist, even in the most formal and serious of places. Later, when the family stopped to rest in a small garden near the palace exit, the child's imagination began to take over again. They pictured themselves growing up and embodying the lessons they had learned from the guard, standing tall in the face of challenges, remaining calm under pressure, and treating others with quiet respect and understanding. They imagined their own life as a journey where every small gesture of kindness mattered, where observing and understanding others could make a difference, and where curiosity could lead to growth. "Mom," the child said softly, looking up with wide eyes, "I think I want to be someone like him when I grow up, calm, strong, and kind." The mother smiled, her eyes glistening slightly with pride. "You will, sweetheart. Today is just the beginning. Life will give you many lessons, and if you remember this one, you'll do very well." She reached down and brushed a strand of hair from the child's face. "Curiosity and respect will take you far, just like they did today." The child's sibling, listening to the conversation, nodded in agreement. "I think I want to be like that too," they said softly. "Not just calm, but also kind, and brave enough to learn from others without words." The mother laughed quietly, delighted by the insight her children were showing. She realized that even in such a short visit, the palace had become more than a sightseeing location. It had become a classroom, a place where life lessons were learned in the most unexpected ways. As the family began walking home, the child's thoughts kept returning to the guard. They wondered about his daily life, how he maintained such discipline, and what it was like to stand in the hot sun or the cold wind while remaining calm and composed. They imagined that, despite the strict rules, the guard probably had moments of kindness and humor in private, just like anyone else. And they hoped that, in some small way, the guard knew how much his silent gestures had meant to them. That evening, as the family gathered for dinner at home, the child could hardly contain their excitement. They recounted every detail to their parents, describing how the guard had stood so still, how they had noticed the subtle nod, and how the silent communication had made them feel understood and respected. The parents listened attentively, nodding with pride and sometimes smiling at the child's imaginative retelling of events. The child's father, who had been listening quietly, finally said, "You know, it's amazing how much you can learn just by watching and paying attention. Sometimes words aren't necessary. You can understand a lot through actions and gestures just like you did today." The child nodded eagerly. "Yes, and I want to remember it forever. I want to be kind, patient, and strong, just like him." That night before going to bed, the child lay awake thinking about the events of the day. They replayed each gesture, each moment of silent acknowledgement, and every detail of the courtyard. They realized that the visit had given them more than memories. It had given them lessons they could carry throughout their life. Lessons about respect, patience, observation, and human kindness. The next morning, the child woke up and immediately began drawing a picture of the palace. In the drawing, the guard was standing tall, perfectly still, but there was a small sparkle in his eyes, just as the child had imagined. Around the guard, The child drew tiny figures of themselves and their sibling, standing quietly, observing, learning, and feeling a connection that words could not describe. The drawing captured the essence of what they had experienced: curiosity meeting patience, innocence meeting discipline, and understanding bridging the gap between two very different worlds. Later, when the family shared the story with friends and relatives, the child described everything in vivid detail. They told the story of how a simple gesture, a nod, a tilt of the head, had taught them lessons more powerful than anything they had learned in school. Everyone who listened was touched by the story, amazed that such a small, silent interaction could leave such a strong impression. The child realized that the day at the palace had been more than just a visit. It had been a life lesson wrapped in a story of curiosity, observation, and human connection. They had learned that respect and kindness could be communicated without words, that patience could create understanding, and that even the most disciplined people had humanity that could shine through in small, meaningful ways. In the weeks and months that followed, the child often thought about that day. Whenever they felt impatient, frustrated, or unsure, they remembered the guard standing tall, calm, and composed. Whenever they wanted to be brave, they recalled the silent gestures and the quiet acknowledgement that had made them feel understood. And whenever they met new people, they tried to remember that respect and kindness could be shown in ways beyond words, through patience, observation, and small, thoughtful actions. The experience became a story the child shared often, not just for fun, but as a reminder to themselves and others about the lessons learned in a royal courtyard. It was a story about curiosity, about learning through observation, about connecting with others even in silence, and about finding humanity in unexpected places. Years later, the child would look back on that visit with gratitude. They would remember the warmth of the sun on their face, the gentle rustle of the flags, the soft movement of the breeze through the courtyard, and the silent understanding between themselves and the guard. And they would realize that it was not the grandeur of the palace or the historic significance of the place that mattered most. It was the small moments, the subtle gestures, and the lessons learned quietly that had made the day unforgettable. The memory stayed with them forever, shaping the way they approached life, relationships, and the world around them. And every time they encountered someone disciplined, patient, or kind, they would remember the royal guard who had taught them so much, without ever speaking a single word.